The neon buzzed like a tired cicada above the door of Marla's roadside diner, its pink glow bleeding into the October fog that rolled across Highway 66. Inside, the smell of bacon grease and strong coffee had soaked into every vinyl booth, every chipped ceramic mug, every crack in the linoleum floor. Connie Dawes wiped down the counter for the third time that hour, not because it needed it, but because her hands needed something to do while she watched the empty parking lot through rain-streaked glass. It was 8:30 on a Tuesday evening, and the only customer was Bud Trammell in his usual spot by the window. The old farmer nursed his decaf and worked a crossword puzzle with a pencil worn down to a nub. He'd been coming to this diner for 40 years, back when Connie's mother-in-law Marla still ran the griddle, and the town of Cedar Hollow had 2 stoplights instead of 1. Now, Marla was 10 years in the ground. Connie's husband Ray had followed her 5 years later, and the second stoplight had been removed when the feed mill closed down. Connie was 54 years old, with hands that knew hard work and a face that had learned to smile through trouble. She had laugh lines around her eyes and a streak of gray in her auburn hair that she'd stopped bothering to dye. The diner was all she had left of Ray, and she'd held on to it the way a person holds on to a photograph of someone they'll never see again. But holding on was getting harder. The envelope from Holloway Property Management sat unopened in her apron pocket, though she already knew what it said. 3 months behind. 30 days to vacate. She'd read the first 2 letters enough times to recite them from memory. The bell above the door chimed, and Connie looked up to see a man step inside, bringing the cold and the smell of rain with him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, somewhere in his early 60s, with a gray beard trimmed close and deep-set eyes the color of wet slate. His leather jacket was old and cracked at the elbows, and on the back she could see the faded patch of a motorcycle club, a horseman carrying a shepherd's crook above the words Iron Horseman MC. Water dripped from the brim of his black riding cap onto the floor. He stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the room the way a man does when he's spent a lifetime walking into unfamiliar places. His gaze passed over Bud, lingered on the empty booths, and finally settled on Connie behind the counter. He gave a small nod, then walked to the far end of the counter and lowered himself onto a stool with the careful movements of someone whose joints had logged too many miles. "Evening," Connie said, setting a menu in front of him. "Coffee? Please?" His voice was low and rough, like gravel turning under a slow wheel. She poured him a cup, without asking how he took it. Black, she figured. She was right. He wrapped both hands around the mug and held it like a man trying to warm himself from the inside out. Up close, she could see the weariness in his face, not just tired from the road, but something deeper, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. "Kitchen's still open if you're hungry," she said. "Got meatloaf tonight. It's better than it sounds." The corner of his mouth lifted just barely. "Maybe in a bit." Connie gave him space and went back to her wiping. Bud glanced up from his crossword, studied the stranger for a moment, then returned to his puzzle without a word. That was the thing about Cedar Hollow. People minded their own business until they had a reason not to. The biker drank his coffee slowly, staring at nothing in particular. After a while, Connie refilled his cup without being asked. He nodded his thanks. She noticed his wallet sitting on the counter beside his keys, worn leather, thin as a whisper. When he finally opened the menu, his eyes moved to the prices first, the way hers did at the grocery store. 20 minutes later, he set down his empty mug and reached for the wallet. Connie watched him open it and saw what she'd already suspected, a few crumpled singles and nothing else. He stared at the bills for a long moment, then let out a slow breath and set $2 on the counter. "I appreciate the coffee," he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like apology. Connie picked up the $2 and set them back in front of him. "Coffee's on the house tonight." He looked at her, and for a moment, the weariness cracked open into something like confusion. "Ma'am." "Connie," she said, "and it's just coffee. You look like you've had a long ride." He held her gaze, and she saw him struggling with something. Pride, maybe, or the weight of kindness from a stranger when you've forgotten what it feels like. Finally, he picked up the bills and tucked them back into his wallet. "Earl," he said, "most folks call me Shepherd." "Well, Shepherd, you're welcome to sit as long as you like. Warm up before you head back out there." He didn't leave. He sat there for another hour, and Connie refilled his cup twice more without comment. Bud finished his crossword and headed home with a wave. The rain picked up, drumming against the windows, and the highway outside turned into a black river, reflecting the diner's neon glow. Connie started her closing routine, and still the man sat, turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the counter. At 9:45, he finally stood. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notepad and a pencil, scribbled something, and tore off the page. He set it on the counter beside his empty mug. "Thank you, Connie," he said, "for the coffee and the kindness." Before she could respond, he was out the door and into the rain. She heard the rumble of a motorcycle engine cough to life, then fade into the distance until there was nothing left but the sound of water on glass. Connie picked up the note. The handwriting was neat and slanted, the letters pressed deep into the paper. "Kindness is never wasted. It just takes time to find its way home." She read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket beside the eviction notice. For a moment, standing alone in the empty diner, with the neon buzzing overhead, she let herself feel the strangeness of it, a tired biker, a free cup of coffee, and a note that felt like a promise she didn't understand. She locked the door at 10, turned off the sign, and drove home through the rain to her small house on Elm Street. She fell asleep that night without opening the envelope from Holloway Property Management. There would be time enough for bad news in the morning. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that 6 hours north, in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Tulsa, a man named Shepard was making a phone call, and by the time the sun rose over Cedar Hollow, nothing in that little town would ever be quite the same. Wednesday morning came gray and cold, the kind of October day that made the bones ache and the sky look like dirty dishwater. Connie opened the diner at 6, same as always, flipping on the lights and starting the coffee before the sun had fully climbed above the grain elevator at the edge of town. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, but the parking lot was still slick and puddles gathered in the potholes she couldn't afford to fill. By 7, the regulars had trickled in. Bud Trammell took his usual spot, newspaper folded beside his coffee cup. Pastor David Reyes sat 2 stools down, working through a plate of eggs and toast, while he reviewed his notes for Sunday's sermon. A couple of truck drivers passed through, left decent tips, and were gone before 8. It was a morning like any other, except for the envelope still sitting unopened on Connie's kitchen table at home, and the strange note from the biker still folded in her apron pocket. She hadn't told anyone about the man called Shepard. There was nothing to tell, really. A stranger had come in, she'd given him free coffee, and he'd left. That was the whole of it. But she found herself thinking about his eyes, the way they'd carried something heavier than road dust, and the words he'd written on that slip of paper. Kindness is never wasted. She wanted to believe that. Some days it was harder than others. Around 9:30, the bell above the door chimed, and Connie looked up, expecting another trucker, or maybe one of the ladies from the Methodist Auxiliary. Instead, she saw Garrett Holloway. He stood in the doorway like he owned the place, which, in a sense, he did. Garrett was 47 years old, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome once, before ambition hardened it into something sharper. He wore a charcoal overcoat that cost more than Connie made in a month, and his shoes were polished to a shine that looked almost offensive against the diner's scuffed linoleum. His father had been a farmer, same as everyone else's father in Cedar Hollow, but Garrett had gone off to Oklahoma City, made money in commercial real estate, and come back 5 years ago to buy up half the town's property. He called it investment. Most folks called it something else when he wasn't around to hear. "Morning, Connie." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It never did. "Garrett." She kept her voice even. "Coffee?" "No, thank you. I'm not staying long." He walked to the counter and set down a manila folder, thick with papers. "I wanted to deliver this in person, professional courtesy." Connie didn't touch the folder. She already knew what was inside. "I got your letters." "Then you know where we stand." He tapped the folder with one manicured finger. 3 months behind, Connie. I've been more than patient. The grace period ends Friday. If the balance isn't cleared by 5 o'clock, I'll have no choice but to begin eviction proceedings." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Connie felt the ripples spread through her chest, but she kept her face calm. She'd had practice. "And if I need more time?" Garrett's smile thinned. Time won't change the numbers. You're underwater, and we both know it. The diner hasn't turned a real profit in years. I'm offering you a clean exit. Sign over the lease, and I'll waive the back rent. You can walk away free and clear. Walk away to what? He shrugged, a gesture that managed to be both casual and dismissive. That's not really my concern. I've got a buyer lined up, a fuel company out of Tulsa. They want to put a gas station and convenience store on this lot. It's progress, Connie. Cedar Hollow needs it. Cedar Hollow needs a lot of things, she said quietly. A gas station chain isn't one of them. For a moment, something flickered in Garrett's eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or the impatience of a man who wasn't used to hearing no. But he smoothed it away and straightened his coat. Friday at 5. I hope you'll make the right decision. He left without another word. The bell chimed behind him, and the diner fell silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant clatter of Jolene washing dishes in the back. Bud Trammell looked up from his newspaper. That man's got a soul like a strip mall. Pastor Reyes said nothing, but his eyes followed Garrett's car as it pulled out of the lot, and his expression carried the weight of a sermon he hadn't written yet. Connie picked up the manila folder and carried it to the back office without opening it. She set it on the desk beside a photograph of Ray, taken the year they'd gotten married. He was smiling in the picture, young and full of plans, standing in front of the diner with his arm around his mother. Marla's Roadside Diner, the sign read, the same sign that still buzzed and flickered out front. I'm trying, Connie whispered to the photograph. I'm trying. The rest of the day passed in a blur of coffee refills and small talk. Connie smiled when she was supposed to smile, and made change when she was supposed to make change, but her mind kept circling back to Friday. 2 days. She had 2 days to come up with 3 months of back rent, and she didn't have 2 weeks' worth in the register. That evening, after the last customer had gone and Jolene had headed home to her little boy, Connie sat alone in the empty diner and finally opened the manila folder. The numbers stared back at her, cold and absolute. Past due. Final notice. Legal action. The words blurred together until they stopped meaning anything at all. She thought about calling her sister in Wichita, but Linda had her own troubles and 3 kids still in school. She thought about the bank, but she'd already refinanced twice and been turned down for a third. She thought about selling the diner equipment, but it was old and worn and wouldn't fetch enough to cover a single month's rent. For the first time in 5 years, Connie let herself cry. Not the quiet tears she sometimes shed at night when no one was watching, but real sobs that shook her shoulders and made her chest ache. She cried for Ray, who had believed in this place more than he'd believed in anything. She cried for Marla, who had built it with her own hands. She cried for herself, for the years she'd poured into keeping it alive, and for the bitter knowledge that it might not have been enough. When the tears finally stopped, she wiped her face with a napkin and looked around the empty diner. The booths where families had celebrated birthdays, the counter where Ray had proposed to her 30 years ago, sliding a ring across the formica like it was the most natural thing in the world. The kitchen where Marla had taught her to make biscuits from scratch, back when Connie was just a nervous young bride trying to earn her mother-in-law's approval. This place was more than a building. It was memory made solid. It was proof that the people she'd loved had existed, had mattered, had left something behind. She couldn't let Garrett Holloway turn it into a gas station, but she didn't know how to stop him. Connie locked up at 10 and drove home through streets that were empty and dark. Cedar Hollow had never been a lively town, but lately it felt like something was draining out of it, one closed storefront at a time. The hardware store had shut down last spring. The pharmacy had been bought by a chain and moved to the highway. Even the grocery store was struggling, its parking lot half empty most days. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the small house she'd shared with Ray. The porch light was on. She always left it on, a habit from the years when he'd worked late and she'd wanted him to know she was waiting. Now, it just burned for no one, a small beacon against the dark. Inside, she made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. The envelope from Holloway Property Management was still there, unopened, beside a stack of bills and a grocery list she hadn't finished. She didn't open it. She already knew what it said. Instead, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the note from the biker. The paper was soft now, worn from her fingers returning to it throughout the day. She unfolded it and read the words again. Kindness is never wasted. It just takes time to find its way home. She didn't know why she'd kept it. Maybe because it was the only gentle thing that had happened to her in weeks. Maybe because the man who wrote it had looked at her like she mattered, even though he didn't know her name until she'd told him. Connie set the note on the table beside her tea and stared at it for a long time. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard the rumble of engines, low and steady, like thunder rolling in from far away. But that was probably just her imagination. She finished her tea, turned off the lights, and went to bed. Tomorrow was Thursday. One day left before Friday. One day left before everything she'd built came tumbling down. She fell asleep with the note still clutched in her hand, the words pressing into her palm like a prayer she didn't quite believe. What Connie didn't know was that 300 miles away, in a dozen different towns across Oklahoma and Kansas and Texas, men were checking their bikes, filling their tanks, and making plans. Phone calls had been made. Debts had been remembered. A woman who had shown kindness to a stranger was about to learn that some kindnesses are never forgotten. The engines would come with the dawn. Thursday broke clear and cold, the sky a pale blue that seemed almost too bright after days of gray. Frost clung to the windows of Marla's roadside diner, and Connie had to scrape the windshield of her old Chevy twice before she could see well enough to drive. Her breath fogged in the morning air as she unlocked the diner's front door, and she stood for a moment in the doorway, looking out at the empty highway and the fields beyond, still and silent in the early light. One more day, that's all she had left. She started the coffee, turned on the grill, and tried not to think about tomorrow. Jolene arrived at 7, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her 3-year-old son Marcus balanced on her hip. The boy's grandmother was supposed to watch him, but she'd come down with a cold, and Jolene couldn't afford to miss a shift. "I'm sorry," Jolene said, setting Marcus down in the corner booth with a coloring book and a box of crayons. "He'll be good, I promise." "Don't apologize," Connie said. "He's welcome here, always." Marcus looked up at her with wide brown eyes and held out a crayon. "You want to color?" Connie smiled, the first real smile she'd felt in days. "Maybe later, sweetheart. I've got to make some pancakes first." The morning passed slowly. Bud came in at his usual time, ordered his usual coffee, and worked his usual crossword. A few other regulars drifted through. Farmers mostly, men with calloused hands and quiet voices who had known Connie's husband and still came to the diner out of loyalty, as much as hunger. They talked about the weather, about cattle prices, about the high school football team's chances this Friday night. Nobody mentioned Garrett Holloway or the eviction notice, though Connie suspected they all knew. In a town this small, secrets didn't stay secret for long. Around 11, Pastor David Reyes came in and took a seat at the counter. He was a tall man in his early 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes that had seen more grief than most people could imagine. He'd buried Connie's husband 5 years ago, and he'd sat with her in this very diner the night after the funeral, saying nothing, just being there. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Connie shrugged, wiping down the counter that didn't need wiping. "I'm still standing." "That's something." He paused, turning his coffee cup in slow circles. "I heard about Holloway's deadline." "Word travels fast." "It does." He looked at her, his gaze steady. "I want you to know that whatever happens, you're not alone. The church can't cover 3 months of back rent, but we can help. A meal here, a bill there. You've got people who care about you, Connie." She felt her throat tighten and had to look away. "I appreciate that, Pastor. I do." "But it's not enough," he said quietly. "I know. I wish it were." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the truth settling between them. Then the bell above the door chimed, and they both looked up. The man who walked in was not a regular. He was young, maybe 30, with a lean build and a face that hadn't seen a razor in several days. He wore a leather jacket with a patch on the shoulder, a horseman carrying a shepherd's crook, and his boots were scuffed from miles of road. He looked around the diner with sharp, searching eyes until they landed on Connie. "Ma'am," he said, walking to the counter, "are you Connie Dawes?" She felt a flicker of unease. "I am. Can I help you?" The young man reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I've got a message for you, from Shepard." The name hit her like a gust of cold air. She took the paper, her fingers suddenly unsteady, and unfolded it. The handwriting was the same as before, neat, slanted, pressed deep into the page. "Connie, you showed me kindness when I had nothing to offer in return. That's rarer than you know. I made some calls. Help is coming. Don't give up yet. Shepard." She read it twice, then looked up at the young man. "I don't understand. What kind of help?" He smiled just a little. "You'll see tomorrow. Shepard wanted me to tell you to keep the diner open. No matter what happens, keep it open." Before she could ask another question, he touched the brim of an imaginary hat, turned, and walked out the door. Through the window, she watched him climb onto a motorcycle parked at the edge of the lot, a bike she hadn't noticed when he came in, and ride off down the highway until he was just a speck against the pale horizon. Pastor Reyes stared at the door, then at Connie. "What was that about?" She shook her head slowly, the note trembling in her hand. "I have no idea." But something had shifted inside her. The weight that had pressed down on her chest for days felt lighter, not gone, but bearable. She didn't know what Shepard had planned or what kind of help was coming. She didn't know if it would be enough, but for the first time since Garrett Holloway had walked into her diner, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Hope. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze. Connie moved through her routines, pouring coffee, taking orders, wiping tables, but her mind kept returning to the note in her apron pocket. She found herself looking out the window more than usual, watching the highway, as if expecting something to appear on the horizon. Around 4 o'clock, the phone rang. Connie picked it up, expecting a supplier or maybe her sister checking in. "Marla's Roadside Diner," she said. "Is this Connie?" The voice was male, older, with a slight rasp. "Speaking." "My name's Red. I'm calling from Amarillo. Shepard asked me to check in, make sure you're still planning to open tomorrow." Connie gripped the phone tighter. "I am, but I still don't understand what's happening." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "You will. Just keep the coffee hot and the door unlocked. We'll be there by sunrise." "We?" she asked. "How many of you are there?" Another pause. "Enough." The line went dead. Connie stood there for a long moment, the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the dial tone. Then she hung up and turned to find Jolene watching her from the kitchen doorway, Marcus asleep on her shoulder. "Everything okay?" Jolene asked. "I think so," Connie said slowly. "I think something's about to happen. I just don't know what." That night, after closing, Connie didn't go straight home. Instead, she sat in the diner with the lights off, looking out at the empty parking lot and the highway beyond. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the asphalt, and the silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. She thought about Ray, about the years they'd spent building this place into something that mattered. She thought about Marla, who had started with nothing but a griddle and a dream. She thought about all the people who had passed through these doors, the truckers and farmers, the families and loners, the broken and the blessed. This diner had fed them all, had given them a place to rest, a moment of warmth in a cold world. Maybe that was worth fighting for. Maybe that was worth believing in. She pulled out Shepard's first note, the one he'd left on the counter Tuesday night, and read it one more time. Kindness is never wasted. It just takes time to find its way home. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow was the deadline. Tomorrow, Garrett Holloway expected her to surrender, but Connie Dawes had never been good at giving up. She locked the diner, drove home, and set her alarm for 4:30 in the morning. Whatever was coming, she wanted to be ready. She wanted to see it arrive. She slept fitfully, her dreams full of engine noise and distant thunder. And sometime in the darkest hours of the night, while Cedar Hollow slept and the highway lay empty and still, the first motorcycles began to move. They came from Tulsa and Amarillo, from Wichita and Dallas, from small towns and big cities across 4 states. They rode through the darkness with their headlights cutting the night, a river of chrome and leather flowing toward a place most of them had never seen. They rode for a woman they had never met. They rode because Shepard had called. And when the sun rose over Cedar Hollow on Friday morning, Connie Dawes would learn what it meant to be remembered by men who never forgot a kindness. Connie arrived at the diner at 5 in the morning, a full hour before her usual time. The sky was still dark, the stars fading slowly into a bruised purple along the eastern horizon. Her breath hung in the air as she unlocked the front door, and the cold bit at her fingers as she fumbled with the keys. She didn't know what she was expecting to find, but the empty parking lot and the silent highway made her wonder if she'd imagined the whole thing. The messages, the phone calls, the promise of help that seemed too strange to be real. She turned on the lights, started the coffee, and began her opening routine. The familiar motions steadied her hands, if not her thoughts. She cracked eggs into a bowl, laid bacon on the griddle, and set out the day's pies in the glass case by the register. The diner filled with the smell of breakfast, warm and ordinary, and for a few minutes Connie let herself pretend it was just another Friday. Then she heard it. At first, it was so faint she thought it might be a truck on the highway, or maybe the wind picking up across the fields. But the sound didn't fade. It grew, a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the floor and into her bones. She set down the spatula and walked to the window. The horizon was changing. Where the highway met the edge of town, pinpricks of light had begun to appear. 1, then 5, then 20, then more than she could count. They moved in formation, a slow procession of headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a river of fire. The rumble became a roar, and the roar became thunder, and the thunder shook the windows of Marla's roadside diner until the coffee cups rattled on their hooks. Connie's hand found the edge of the counter, and she held on. They came down Main Street in rows of 3 and 4, their engines drowning out every other sound in the world. Harley-Davidsons and Indians, choppers and cruisers, chrome gleaming under the streetlights that still burned against the fading night. The riders wore leather jackets with patches she didn't recognize, club names and chapter numbers from cities she'd never visited. But on every shoulder, she saw the same symbol, a horseman carrying a shepherd's crook. The first bikes turned into the parking lot, and then the next, and then the next. They kept coming. They filled the lot and spilled onto the street, lining up along the curb and the sidewalk and the empty field beside the diner. Connie stopped counting at 100. By the time the last engine cut off, there were closer to 300, and the silence that followed was so sudden and so complete that it rang in her ears like a bell. For a long moment, nobody moved. The riders sat on their bikes, breath fogging in the cold air, their eyes turned toward the diner, toward her. Then a figure at the front of the formation swung off his motorcycle and removed his helmet. Gray beard, slate-colored eyes, a face she had seen only once before but would never forget. Shepard walked across the parking lot, his boots crunching on the gravel, and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked up at Connie, standing frozen in the doorway, and the corner of his mouth lifted in that same barely-there smile she remembered from Tuesday night. "Morning, Connie," he said. "Hope you made enough coffee." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Behind Shepard, the other riders began to dismount, moving with the quiet discipline of men who had done this before. They stretched road-stiff limbs and spoke in low voices, their breath rising in clouds. A few nodded at Connie as they approached. Others touched the brims of their caps or lifted a hand in greeting. "I don't understand," she finally managed. "Why are you all here?" Shepard climbed the steps and stood before her, close enough that she could see the road dust on his jacket and the weariness that still lingered in his eyes. But there was something else there now, something that looked almost like peace. "Because you helped me when I had nothing," he said, "and because that's not the kind of thing we forget." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, thick and heavy, and pressed it into her hands. "This is from the brothers. Every man here put something in. It's not charity, Connie. It's a debt paid." Her fingers trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was cash, more cash than she had seen in one place in her entire life. Bills of every denomination, folded and stacked and held together with rubber bands. She looked up at Shepard, her vision blurring. "I can't accept this." "You can," he said quietly, "and you will. That's not a request." Before she could argue, the bell above the door chimed, and Jolene appeared, Marcus on her hip, her eyes wide as dinner plates. She stared at the parking lot full of motorcycles, then at the crowd of leather-clad men gathering on the porch, then at Connie holding an envelope stuffed with money. "What in the world?" "Jolene," Connie said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I think we're going to need more coffee, and more bacon, and more everything." The next 2 hours were a blur of motion and noise and laughter. The bikers filed into the diner in shifts, filling every booth and every stool, standing 3 deep along the walls when the seats ran out. They ordered breakfast, eggs and pancakes, bacon and hash browns, toast and more coffee, and they paid for everything in cash, leaving tips that made Jolene's eyes water. The register filled up and overflowed, and Connie had to start stacking bills in a shoebox she found in the back office. But it wasn't just the money. It was the way they treated the place, like it mattered. They bussed their own tables, carried their own dishes to the kitchen, held doors for each other and for the few bewildered locals who wandered in to see what all the commotion was about. One man, a giant with arms like tree trunks and a tattoo of a cross on his neck, got down on his knees to help Marcus pick up the crayons he'd spilled. Another, older and grayer than Shepard, sat in the corner booth and quietly fixed the wobbly leg that had annoyed Connie for 3 years. Word spread through Cedar Hollow like wildfire. By 8 o'clock, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk across the street, neighbors and shopkeepers watching the scene with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Connie saw Bud Trammell push through the crowd and make his way to his usual seat, where he sat down, ordered his usual coffee, and opened his newspaper as if 300 bikers in the parking lot were the most normal thing in the world. Pastor Reyes arrived around 9, still wearing his clerical collar, his face pale with shock. He found Connie in the kitchen, flipping pancakes on a griddle that hadn't worked this hard in years. "Connie," he said, "what is happening?" She laughed, a sound that surprised her with its lightness. "I gave a man free coffee, Pastor. I guess he decided to pay me back." At 9:30, a black sedan pulled into the lot. It had to park on the street because there was no room among the motorcycles, and Connie watched through the window as Garrett Holloway stepped out, his face twisted with confusion and something that might have been fear. He picked his way through the crowd of bikers, his polished shoes looking ridiculous against the gravel and the chrome. A few of the men watched him pass, their expressions unreadable. Nobody stopped him, but nobody moved out of his way either. By the time he reached the diner's front door, his face was flushed, and his hands were shaking. Connie met him on the porch. "What is this?" Garrett demanded, gesturing at the sea of motorcycles. "What the hell is going on here?" "Breakfast rush," Connie said calmly. "Can I get you some coffee?" "I'm not here for coffee. I'm here to—" He stopped, his eyes catching on the envelope still clutched in her hand. "What's that?" Connie opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of bills. She counted out the exact amount she owed, 3 months of back rent, down to the penny, and held it out to him. "This is what I owe you," she said, "paid in full." Garrett stared at the money like it might bite him. "Where did you get this?" "Does it matter?" He looked at the bikers, at the crowd on the sidewalk, at the diner packed with customers for the first time in years. Something shifted in his face, a calculation being made and remade behind his eyes. Connie could see him weighing his options, measuring the cost of pushing forward against the cost of backing down. Shepard appeared at Connie's shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching Garrett with eyes that had seen harder men fold. Garrett took the money. "This covers the back rent," he said, his voice tight. "But the lease is still month to month. I can still—" "You can," Shepard said quietly, "but I wouldn't recommend it." For a long moment, nobody moved. The air between them crackled with something unspoken, a line being drawn in the gravel and the silence. Then Garrett Holloway tucked the money into his coat, turned on his heel, and walked back to his car without another word. He didn't look back. The cheer that went up from the diner could be heard 3 blocks away. Jolene burst into tears. Bud Trammell raised his coffee cup in a toast. Pastor Reyes bowed his head and whispered something that might have been a prayer. And Connie Dawes, standing on the porch of the diner she'd almost lost, felt something break open inside her chest. A knot of fear and grief and loneliness that had been tightening for 5 years, finally coming undone. Shepard put a hand on her shoulder. "You going to be okay?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." "Good." He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "Now how about that coffee? I've been writing all night, and I could use a cup." Connie laughed, a real laugh, full and warm and free. "Coffee's on the house," she said, "for all of you, today and every day you come back." Shepard shook his head. "We pay our way, Connie. That's the code." "Then stay for lunch," she said, "and dinner, and breakfast tomorrow if you want. Stay as long as you like." He looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them, an understanding that didn't need words. Then he nodded, once, and followed her inside. The diner stayed open until midnight that night. By the time the last biker finished his last cup of coffee and headed out to his motorcycle, Connie had served more meals in one day than she usually served in a month. The register was full, the kitchen was empty, and her feet ached in a way they hadn't ached in years. It was the best kind of tired she'd ever felt. Saturday morning came soft and quiet, the way mornings do after something important has happened. Connie woke at her usual time, but she didn't rush. She lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the birds outside her window and the distant hum of a truck passing on the highway. The house felt different somehow, not emptier, but lighter, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. She drove to the diner at 6 and found Shepard sitting on the porch steps, a paper cup of gas station coffee in his hand. His motorcycle was parked at the edge of the lot, already packed and ready for the road. The other bikers had left in the night, slipping away in small groups the way they'd come, their engines fading into the darkness like thunder rolling back over the horizon. Only Shepard had stayed. "You're up early," Connie said, climbing out of her car. "Couldn't sleep." He stood, wincing slightly as his knees straightened. "Wanted to say goodbye before I headed out." She unlocked the door and held it open. "At least let me make you a real cup of coffee first. That gas station stuff will kill you." He smiled and followed her inside. The diner was clean, cleaner than it had been in years. The bikers had done more than eat. They'd scrubbed the floors, wiped down the windows, even polished the chrome on the stools until it shone. Someone had fixed the flickering light above the register. Someone else had patched the cracked vinyl on booth number 4. Small repairs, quiet kindnesses, left behind like fingerprints. Connie started the coffee and leaned against the counter while it brewed. Shepard sat on the same stool he'd taken Tuesday night, his hands wrapped around the empty cup, his eyes distant. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." "Why me? Out of all the diners on all the highways, why did you stop here?" Shepard was quiet for a moment. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed. Outside, a car passed on the highway, its headlights sweeping briefly across the windows. "My wife used to love places like this," he said finally. "Small towns, roadside diners. She said you could tell the soul of a place by how it treated strangers." He paused, turning the cup in his hands. "She passed 3 years ago. Cancer. I've been on the road ever since, trying to outrun something that can't be outrun." Connie didn't say anything. She just listened. "Tuesday night, I was running on empty. Hadn't eaten in 2 days, hadn't slept in 3. I stopped here because the light was on and I didn't have anywhere else to go." He looked up at her, his slate-colored eyes steady. "You gave me coffee when I couldn't pay. You didn't ask questions. You didn't judge. You just saw me. Do you know how rare that is?" She poured him a fresh cup and set it on the counter. "I think I do." They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. The sun rose higher, painting the diner in shades of gold and amber. Bud Trammell's truck pulled into the lot at 7 sharp, same as always. He waved through the window, then stopped when he saw Shepard at the counter. After a moment he nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement, and headed for his usual booth. "The others?" Connie said. "The men who came yesterday. How did you get them all to show up?" Shepard shrugged. "Made some calls. Told them what you did for me. That's all it took." "That's all?" "You'd be surprised how many of us are out there, Connie. Men who've been forgotten, men who've been written off. When someone shows us kindness, real kindness, no strings attached, we remember. And when one of our own puts out the call, we answer." He took a sip of his coffee. "It's not complicated, it's just loyalty." She thought about that for a moment. Loyalty. Such a simple word for something so rare. Around 8, Shepard stood and set a $20 bill on the counter. Connie tried to push it back, but he held up a hand. "We pay our way," he said. "Always." She walked him out to the parking lot. His motorcycle gleamed in the morning light, chrome and black leather, a machine built for distance. He swung a leg over the seat and settled into position, his hands finding the handlebars with the ease of long practice. "Will I see you again?" Connie asked. "Maybe." He pulled on his helmet, then paused. "There's a ride every October, a memorial run for brothers we've lost. We pass through this part of Oklahoma on the way to the Veterans Cemetery in Fort Gibson." He looked at her. "Might be we could make Cedar Hollow a stop, if you'd have us." Connie smiled. "I'd like that." He nodded, kicked the engine to life, and pulled out of the lot. She watched him ride down Main Street, past the hardware store and the church and the old grain elevator, until he was just a speck on the highway and then nothing at all. The diner stayed open that day, and the day after, and the day after that. Word of what had happened spread through Cedar Hollow and beyond, carried by the farmers and truckers who passed through, repeated in church pews and coffee shops and the parking lot of the grocery store. People who hadn't visited the diner in years started coming back. Some out of curiosity, some out of solidarity, some just because they wanted to see the woman who had earned the loyalty of 300 bikers with a single cup of coffee. Garrett Holloway sold his stake in the property 2 weeks later. The new owner, a retired school teacher from Tulsa, offered Connie a 5-year lease at half the old rate. She signed it at the counter where Ray had proposed to her 30 years before. Jolene got a raise. Marcus got a corner booth with his name on it, unofficial, but understood. Pastor Reyes started holding a monthly breakfast Bible study at the diner, and Bud Trammell never missed a single one. And every October, when the leaves turned gold and the air grew sharp, the sound of engines would rise from the highway. They came in formation, dozens of them, sometimes more, riding the memorial route to Fort Gibson. They stopped at Marla's roadside diner for coffee and pie, and they left tips that made Jolene cry, and they told stories about brothers who had gone ahead to whatever waited on the other side. Shepard always rode at the front. He never stayed long, just long enough for a cup of coffee and a few quiet words with Connie on the porch. But every year, before he left, he pressed something into her hand, a note, folded small, with words she already knew by heart. Kindness is never wasted. It just takes time to find its way home. She kept every one of them in a wooden box on her nightstand, beside the photograph of Ray and the shawl that still smelled faintly of his aftershave. Some nights, when the house was quiet and the stars were bright, she would read them again and remember that she was not alone, that she had never been alone, that the world was full of strangers who were just friends she hadn't met yet, and that a single act of grace offered freely and without expectation could ripple outward farther than she would ever know. The neon sign buzzed above the door of Marla's roadside diner, its pink glow bleeding into the October night. Inside, the smell of coffee and pie filled the air, and the booths were full of voices, and the woman behind the counter smiled at every stranger who walked through the door. She had learned something that cold Tuesday night when a tired biker with an empty wallet had stumbled into her life. She had learned that kindness was not a transaction. It was a seed. And if you planted it without counting the cost, without expecting a harvest, it would grow in ways you could never predict, in places you would never see, until one day it came back to you 100-fold, carried on the shoulders of strangers who had become family. That was the lesson of Marla's roadside diner. That was the legacy Connie Dawes would leave behind. And somewhere out on the highway, engines rumbled in the dark, carrying men who remembered, men who would never forget, men who knew that the smallest kindness could change the world.